I will be forever the myth.
You're the king of kings, son.
There's always a pecking order. The little packers never mess with the big packers. So I'm a rooster, and he's a chicken, so to speak.
I can attest to the fact that Mike really did change bodybuilding at that time, because that's the time when I got involved with bodybuilding was 77.
Right.
And I remember I started off training 6 days a week, training each body part. I think I was training twice a day or twice a week with each body part, but I was doing 20 sets of body part. I was doing exactly what they said in the magazines, and everybody was. Everybody, because when I joined the gym, I remember everybody was training like that. Everybody was training 6 days a week. So then when Mentzer came along, then everybody started questioning it. And I don't think a lot of people went to the Mike Mentzer routine where you're only doing 5 sets of all-out intensity. But I think everybody cut back. Everybody cut back to 4 days a week, or even like 3 days on, 1 day off.
Yeah,
I remember I was training with a guy at the time. We were doing 6 days a week, and we were training really hard. This guy was like really showing me how to train hard. He was older than me. And I think he was trying to like get me to quit or something. He was trying to crush me, you know. And I was hanging in there, and we were going at it. And I remember we had a debate, like, should we take a day off after 3 days of training? Like, we were really worried that our gains were going to go down.
Just disappear.
Day off, you know.
That's right.
I remember when we took that extra day off, my arms grew like half an inch in a month. You know.
Yeah.
So I think around the country, around the world, everybody was changing. They were rethinking this. Hey, this doesn't make sense going 6 days a week. Mentzer's making sense what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I think he really did have a huge impact on the sport.
Well, and I think, his critics have basically said, well, you know, in his later years, he was crazy and he was advocating you only work out with 2 sets every 2 weeks. He never said that. You know, he basically tailored it to the recovery ability of the client he was working with.
Yeah.
And what he found, and what he said on the tape, was that recovery ability, like a lot of other genetic traits, is expressed across a broad continuum for human beings.
Yeah.
You know, some people can take intense sunlight for only a little bit, others can take it for hours and hours.
Yeah.
And similarly with training, people can take an intense training stress maybe only very infrequently, and there's others that can tolerate it a lot more.
Yeah.
But where he was adamant was that you need to train with a meaningful intensity. You know, you can't just curl a pencil and expect to get results. You know, that there has to be some effort, and there has to be an endpoint to the effort so that you know you've emptied what you had in the tank.
Right.
Now, if you want to do 3 warm-up sets or 4 warm-up sets and then do your set, knock yourself out.
Yeah.
You know, if you only need 1 warm-up set and can hit it, that's good for you too. Go ahead.
Right.
But once you've done it, you've only completed part 1 of a 3-phase process. You know, that's stimulate. You've stimulated your muscles. Okay, well, now you got to recover from that. And that may only be a couple of days. It might be 2 days, 3 days. We don't know. It might be 24 hours for a guy like you.
Yeah.
But recovery has to occur. But you didn't train just to stimulate and recover, because there'd be no progress.
Right.
You want to stimulate, recover, grow, adapt. And adaptation takes time as well as recovery. So you stimulate, phase 1, recover, phase 2, adapt, phase 3. And at that point, that's the soonest you can train again if you want to make progress.
Okay.
But, you know, if you train immediately, you don't really get to enjoy any of the benefits of the adaptation, because as soon as they arrive, you tear it down again.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Arnold, I think, was able to recover very quickly, because I heard stories about him, you know, when he had to training, he would train 6 days a week, twice a day for a contest. I mean, I think when he was getting ready for that 75 Olympia, when he got back doing pump or Stay Hungry.
Yeah.
He came back from Stay Hungry, he was only 210 pounds, and then he had to get ready for the Olympia in 3 months. So immediately he went into 6 days a week, twice a day training. And I remember, like, they were always saying he would burn partners out all the time because people couldn't keep up with it. So there had to be a huge genetic component, obviously, to Arnold. Yeah. The reason that he still, you know, is what he is in the bodybuilding world speaks to the singularity of his
his whole physique and his genetics, and clearly his recovery ability was part of that.
Yeah.
But having said that, there was an interesting thing. Again, it's the way Mike thought about it. Like you and I might look at Arnold and say, oh, well, that's a way to do it. I mean, he did it, right? There's the proof of it. So if you really want to, come back and regain muscle that you lost, like you did from Stay Hungry to the 75 Olympia, it's 4 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Right.
But I remember Mike pointing that out and saying, do the math on that. He said, it's 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. So it's that 24 hours a week. 24 hours a week times 4 months. So 24 times 4 times 4. And it's like some obscene amount of hours that he was in the gym. Like more, if you work for a living, it wouldn't be possible.
Right.
And then he said, now contrast that with Casey. He said at the Colorado experiment.
Right.
And he said, it's like Arnold. Casey was regaining muscle that he lost. He said, so they were both underweight when they started.
Right.
Both probably were not unfamiliar with steroid use.
Right.
Safe to say. He said, and both were genetic phenoms for building muscle.
Right.
So he laid that out. So you got these two guys. You have Arnold, who comes in. He said he was told by John Balick that Arnold went from 200 to 215 in 75. So he gained 15 pounds in 4 months. And Mike said, how come he asked Arnold, I asked Arnold, why didn't you come in at 240 like you did in 72 or whatever it was? And Arnold said, I didn't have the time. I just didn't have the time. And then Mike said, but by contrast, he said, Casey gained 60 pounds in 28 days of muscle. And again, Casey's body fat levels were measured with a radioisotope assay test at the time. And they found that he was at about 3% at the end, body fat, which is competitive level.
Yeah.
Like Arnold probably would have been 3% at the 75 Olympia. So he said, you have Arnold, who was unsuccessful in gaining back all of the muscle he lost, versus Casey, who was successful and gained back way more of it.
Yeah.
He said, so what's the variable? He goes, why was he able to do it and regain all of his muscle and Arnold wasn't? And from Mike's eyes, he said it was the frequency of the training. So Casey trained for half an hour, 3 days a week. Arnold trained 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. He said, even if he stimulated the growth, he wasn't giving his body time to produce it. Just like you said, when you cut back a day, even 1 day, your arms grew about a half inch.
Right.
Same sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I like the fact that he could look at those two things and then bring them together and say, lay it out on the table and say, look at the difference.
Yeah.
It's funny, whenever Mike said that at a seminar, and I happened to record it this was in 81 on a cassette player. And it was one of those things, that seminar, it was like, wow, this is like an education in bodybuilding, which is what it was if you went to one of Mike's seminars. And I played that tape for years until basically that was almost an auto response from me. So I could quote it verbatim. And so fast forwarding to after Mike passed away, and John Balick asked me to continue his column in Iron Man magazine. I had a wealth of material to draw from.
Yeah.
And it was all authentic. It was all Mike's stuff. So, but the interesting thing was the bodybuilding industry has always, since Arnold's arrival, kissed up to him. Not that it's a bad thing. He's done a lot for the sport. He sells a lot of product. I get it. But whenever I would make that simple comparison that Mike did, I'd quote him from the Colorado experiment. John or one of his editors would feel obliged to add an editorial comment. Always. Never failed. Well, it's not really a good comparison because Arnold was dieting for a contest and Casey wasn't. And I thought, well, you make my point for me.
Yeah.
Because they both went at 3%. They ended up at 3% body fat, both of them. This guy, trained a fraction of the time.
Right.
And didn't even have to watch his diet that closely to get to 3%. Arnold was on tuna fish and water and training 4 hours a day, 6 days a week to get to 3%. And he didn't even gain back all the muscle.
Yeah.
And he didn't, and again, in the 80, he was lighter still, so
yeah.
It's, Arnold's, give him his due. I don't begrudge his, and by any means, his success, which is well earned in bodybuilding. He was a phenom.
Yeah.
But it's the ones that are in the orbit around him that keep, kissing his ass, basically.
Right.
Oh, Arnold, oh, you're the funniest guy ever. And oh, didn't he say he's brilliant? Well, no, he's not. He's, he's just he's a guy that had great genetics, was no stranger to the needle, worked hard in the gym, built an amazing physique at a time when there weren't very similar physiques to his out there.
Right.
And blew people's minds. Yeah. And then parlayed that into a film career and parlayed that into a political career.
Yeah.
He was an ambitious guy who's done very well for himself.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he was omniscient. And that, and the training, the way Reg Park trained, because Reg Park trained that way is the best way you ought to train.
Yeah.
Is nonsensical to me. It's just ritualism.
Yeah.
But that's my beef, Chief.
To give Arnold his credit too. I mean, when he was developing his physique, he was building his physique in those peak years, he went way beyond, even though he didn't have the competition, he still pushed himself to be way beyond what anybody else had ever done before.
Again, you look at the pictures of him in 72.
Yeah.
Even in 74.
Yeah.
I mean,
74, yeah. 73.
That may be the greatest physique bodybuilding has ever seen.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just staggering.
I know.
Less so in 75 and less so again in 80, but
right.
Man, 72 to 74.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that to this day we've seen a physique like that.
Yeah. Sometimes I look at pictures of him and I said, that's the ultimate Mr. Olympia. That's what,
that's what well, to this day, when you think Mr. Olympia, who do you think of?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
To this day, even though the younger guys today, but I think of Arnold. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though Lee Haney had more Mr. Olympia titles.
Right.
It's still Arnold for me. I mean, in terms of when I think of Mr. Olympia.
Yeah.
If I were purely objective and went by who won the Olympia title the most, Lee Haney would be the guy, I think.
Yeah, Lee Haney and Ronnie, yeah. I think today's generation looks at Ronnie as the best ever. But, I think when you're looking at overall Mr. Olympia, I just think Arnold had more symmetry. His posing ability was greater. His mental attitude of dominating the competition, all that stuff, I think was superior,
Nope. And again, I'm not an Arnold fan, but, I give him his due. You can't deny his impact on bodybuilding at all. And Mike said that too. Arnold, if he had a gun to his head and say who's the best bodybuilder of all time, so probably Arnold.
Yeah, Robbie and Arnold and Sergio.
Yeah.
But you said no stranger to the needle too. You have to take that into account too of Arnold's success with his type of training. Yeah. And I remember when being a young kid, going back to when I was a young kid, the thing that we didn't understand, me living in Illinois or someone in Iowa or wherever, you're reading the muscle magazines, you're thinking you got to go 6 days a week, 20 sets, 25 sets of body part. You're not taking into account these guys are all taking steroids.
Right.
The steroids weren't a talked about subject back then. It was
not at all. No.
And, they didn't. And if they did talk about them, they usually downplayed their use.
Yeah, so, a little bit of polish. A little bit of polish.
5%.
Yeah, never mind the 40 pounds of muscle you gained over the past 2 months. Yeah, just a little bit of polish there.
Right.
Yeah. Buff that up a bit. Yeah.
So when Mike came in with his philosophy and people started cutting back on the sats and getting more rest days, it worked so much for everybody because most people weren't taking steroids, if you're not a competitive bodybuilder.
Exactly. Yeah, we didn't know about it. We didn't know about it, and Mike was honest. He was the first guy whose articles I read where he mentioned steroid use.
He was, he was totally.
Yeah. And he said, we all do. And those who say they don't take any take the most. I
remember he wrote an article where he said his arm was 18 3/4. And I'm like, that can't be right. He's got to have a 22-inch arm, 21 inch arm for everybody else. But he was so honest about everything. He goes, no, I recorded it. He goes, it's only 18 3/4. I'm like, wow.
Yeah, that's right. He said, I I didn't do it with a pump or have an oblique angle to the measurement, so I got an extra inch out of it. So yeah, no, he was honest. He was very honest, and that's what made him an interesting fellow. He never lied about anything that I can recall.
And that's so refreshing in the world of bodybuilding, you know.
Oh yeah, and he was very honest about his views on contests, about judging contests. And even, you know, again, I remember asking when we talked about the best bodybuilders, the way I phrased the question was, you know, who in your opinion, present company excluded, would be the, you know, top 5 bodybuilders of all time? And he said, present company included. He said, I don't see myself as being in the top 5 physiques of all time. It was like, whoa, that's quite a concession.
Yeah.
And then he, you know, again, promptly listed the ones that he thought were there. And it was like, wow, that's very candid.
Yeah.
Because you ask any bodybuilder, especially one that is good enough to compete at the Olympia level, and you say, you know, who are the top bodybuilders? Somehow their name is going to find its way in there somehow.
Right.
Yeah. So Mike was refreshing that way for sure.
Absolutely. Let's talk about his pro career, John. His whole career was kind of short, but he did his first pro show right after he won that 78 Universe.
Right.
So that was I think it was called the Southern Florida Cup or something.
Yeah, Professional Pro Southern Cup, I think.
Yeah. And it was in, I believe, Miami, right? And this is when the Grand Prix circuits were really starting to go, because if you look up to bodybuilding, the pro contest, aside from the Mr. Olympia, really started in 1978 when they had the Night of the Champions, and then they had, I think they had the Pro World Cup in July that year. I think they only had those 2 shows plus the Mr. Olympia. So by 79, Wayne D'Amelio was working with the IFBB and they were expanding it. So they had, the first one was in Florida, and Mike was in fantastic condition. This was his pro debut, and he wins and he beats Robbie in that contest. Yeah,
and he was in great shape. And, you know, it's unfortunate that, again, no video.
I know. God.
We have no record of it. You know, I mean, there was a couple of photos. Actually, the only magazine that published any photos from that contest was Muscle Mag, Bob Kennedy's publication. And they had some photos from the show, and Mike looked huge. Like, he looked every bit as big as that photo you referenced at the Mr. North America contest.
Yeah.
He was just big. He was ripped. He was... You know, he looked incredible. But according to Mike, the next show, which was in Pittsburgh, he was even bigger, he said.
Yeah.
He said he felt more heavily muscled than even at any other point in his career, including 1980.
Right.
And as you know, there was kind of a funny story there, because he was like ripped. He was huge. You know, Robbie looked worried. Mike got another perfect score. Yeah. This is in the pre-judging, and then off Mike goes to have a plate of pancakes and syrup and some orange juice.
Right.
Came back looking like the Michelin Man, you know, and he, like you said, you know, just by everything, I could tell there was a big difference in my physique when I came back for the evening show. Yeah. Lesson learned, but and he ended up losing the Pittsburgh one to Robbie.
Right.
And then New York followed. That was his third pro show, Night of Champions. And unfortunately, his mother was dying. He got news that his mom was dying. And he went to the show more to honor the contractual obligation. So he said, you know, I was not in great shape, and, you know, certainly didn't deserve to win, and didn't deserve second place. Third place was what he got behind Robbie and Danny. In fact, Danny was the guy who probably should have won that show. Yeah, I talked to Danny about that when I did his interview. Danny said he scored a perfect score, and Robbie beating him at the. Yeah, he did, and then Robbie won the show. Yeah, but Danny was in tremendous shape. Yeah, and Mike had lost his edge and really didn't care at that point, because his mother died, I think, 6 days after the show or something. Yeah. So he had other things on his mind, but nevertheless, he did compete, and he covered those 3 shows, and then fell into a bit of a depression with the death of his mom. And then until there was like only 8 weeks or something left to the 79 Olympia. And his brother told him, don't go in it. He said,
Wow.
we've been through a lot. You've done 3 shows, a 4th show in 1 year.
Yeah.
Everyone will understand. And for some reason, that had the opposite effect on Mike. It spurred him on.
Right.
And he got into what was then his best shape ever.
Yeah.
For the 79 Olympia. And you, young man, happened to go to that, did you not?
Right.
Yeah. Damn. So I never saw Mike compete on stage. So maybe you can share with your viewers what that was like.
Yeah, I remember when over 200-pound class came out in the prejudging. I mean, he really stood out. You could tell he was going to win the class. And Zane looked great too. And, back then with the 2 classes, they weren't really compared until the night show, until they actually did the pose down.
Right.
So, unfortunately, for Mike, they weren't compared at the prejudging. And then Mike outscored Zane. I forget what Zane got. He was close to 300. I think he got like 297 or something. But Mike had 300. And then what they did was they did the pose down, and then the judges did the placement system where they gave a first place to whoever they thought. And I guess Zane just got enough votes to beat Mike.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting. I mean, now that Mike's gone, of course, you look back and think, geez, I wonder what would have happened if he'd won one of those 2 shows, the 79 or the 80.
Yeah.
And I mean, we'll never know, but he came pretty close in 79.
First one too.
Yeah.
And he said he wanted to be the first guy to win his first Olympia, which never happened except for
Yeah.
Scott, of course. But
Yeah, first time competing in it to win it. Yeah, that was his goal.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it must have. I know we got a lot of mixed messages after the show because it kind of broadsided him that he'd lost to Frank Zane, because he thought in terms of symmetry and proportions, Frank's got great symmetry and proportions, but so do I.
Yeah.
But I've also got about 25 pounds of mass on this guy.
Yeah.
And bodybuilding is about bodybuilding. So, I'm bigger, I'm more ripped, I'm stronger.
Yeah.
I haven't lost any symmetry. I haven't lost, every muscle group was balanced.
Right.
And so after the show, he spoke to Reg Park, and Reg said, "Oh, you're too big. When you do that pose, the one you were talking about, where he puts his arms out, because you take up the whole stage, and the audience isn't ready for that." That was Reg Park's thing to him.
Makes no sense.
No, and that's what Mike said to Reg. He said, "Well, aren't you the guy that, that was your métier, was this big mass ahead of your time, and you're telling me that now it's a liability?"
Right.
So he just didn't understand it. Then the other one said, "Oh, you posed too quickly." Only during the pose down.
Right.
And that's when the scores are tabulated.
Yeah.
So really that shouldn't have had any impact. But anyway, he lost the contest and then figured, well, maybe it's because bodybuilding in the late 70s and 80s was starting to break into the mainstream. It was starting to become popular. Gyms were opening up as kind of social centers, and new magazines were coming out. You would see it in the movies, more muscular physiques. It was starting to
break through.
Yeah. And so I think part of the thought was, if we put big muscle guys, Sergio Oliva, Arnold even types, front and center on our magazines and in our contests, that people aren't going to relate to that. Frank Zane, he's got mass and he's got lines and he's got good proportion and good symmetry and good shape, pleasing shape. That's a mainstream physique.
Yeah.
And so I think Mike picked up on that vibe. So he thought, well, the only thing maybe that they're looking at there is definition. That's the biggie. So if you have to be ultra defined, that's what I'm going to do for the 80 Olympia, because that's currently what the judges are looking for. Now, this is assuming everything is on the up and up. The judges are looking for the best physique.
Yeah.
All the other backroom drama of the 80 Olympia wasn't known at this point. It was just, this is a contest.
Hey, John, before we get into 80, let me ask you about 79, because I've heard people say that Mike blew that contest because he was leading going into the night show. He was leading from the prejudging. And then, like he said he did in Pittsburgh, he went out and ate something, and that's why his stomach was sticking out. Do you think that was true?
No. Well, I mean, you heard on the tapes that when he went into 79, he had poured over all his journals. He had learned his lesson.
Mistake from Pittsburgh,
He wasn't going to repeat it because it cost him in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So, no, he didn't lose it. The comment about his stomach is, I think, explained two ways. One, the photos that you see where Zane's got the trophy and Mike's like this, was the moment the decision was announced.
Yeah.
So you're in like this, tight, and the winner is the other guy.
Right.
There's the photo.
I think Zane did a little bit better on the pose down, but that's just because of his experience. You know, I mean, the guy's been competing for 20 years.
Yeah, and Zane was a great poser. But I mean, again, if you put a check mark in every box, mass, definition, symmetry, shape, proportion, posing, okay, you give Zane posing. You don't give him mass.
Yeah.
So that's a wash. So now you're looking at the other categories to determine your winner, right?
Yeah.
But
and in Zane's defense, I mean, that probably was his best condition ever of his whole life. And no argument for me on Frank Zane. Yeah. I again, it depends on what your criteria is. Yeah. For me, coming, as we talked about earlier, from the Bruce Lee background, I like the smaller physique in terms of the size. Frank Zane was the guy. I thought he looked awesome. Yeah.
And that when he did that ad for the Power X, coolest ad I've ever seen in my life. You know, I wanted to look like Frank Zane.
Right.
But if you're looking at it as judging in the categories that we discussed, mass has to be part of it in a bodybuilding show. Has to be.
Yeah.
And so if a guy, as Mike said himself, his physique hadn't changed in terms of muscle mass since 68.
Yeah.
You know, he refined it, but he hadn't gained any muscle to that you would notice.
Or not much.
Yeah. So bodybuilding, very little of that had occurred. You know, body defining, yes, absolutely. But if mass is part of the equation, you got to mark Mike up for that because he had it. Had it in spades, and he didn't sacrifice proportion or symmetry, to get it. And his definition was, if you look at the photos, was, I would say, the photos that I've seen, his definition looked to be the equal of Zane's.
Yeah.
You might disagree with that. You were there, so you might know better. But judging from the photographs I've seen, but yeah, Zane probably imposing would have won that category, I think.
Plus, Zane was Mr. Olympia 2 times already, so they probably put the edge there, you know.
Well, and maybe it's one of those things like in boxing too, where you got to knock out the champ.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
You're not going to decision.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, I totally accept that too. And again, like I say, from an outsider's perspective, what's not to like about Frank Zane?
Oh yeah.
I mean, what a physique. You know, I mean, very impressive physique.
When I interviewed Frank, he kind of dismissed Mike a little bit. You know, when we talked about that, he goes, yeah, you know, he almost was saying it wasn't even close, you know, like follow the leader, I think he said, you know, or something. But I don't think he really gave Mike the credit he deserved for how good Mike looked in that show.
No, probably not. But I mean, again, every bodybuilder is an individual.
Yeah.
And everyone's ego is at different points.
Yeah.
And you know, if
we all remember things our own history, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, Frank had a lot of followers and had a great physique. Interesting though, isn't it, that Frank Zane presently trains more like Mike trained. Yeah, I saw a video of him and he's doing like one set, 3 or 4 upper body exercises. Then another day he does the same thing with lower body, predominantly machines. Mind you, Frank's older now, but nevertheless, you know, when you're not competing, when you're looking to be healthy and fit and looking good, he's basically doing a heavy duty program. Yeah. You know, which was the thing they used to, you got to go 20 sets 6 days a week. Yeah. Okay. But
I think that year, in fact, in 79, I think he was training with a power lifter and he was training heavier than ever before in order to put on muscle. And he did cut back on his he did take more rest days, you know.
Yeah. but I mean, yeah, Frank, clearly Frank and Mike were polar opposites.
Yeah.
Intellectually as well. I mean, Frank was into the writings of people like Gurdjieff and some of the spiritualists. Mike was reason, Aristotle, guys like that. They philosophically they were miles apart.
Frank was interpreting his dreams with Carl Jung.
Carl Jung and Mike had gone through psychiatry.
Yeah,
like he'd studied Jung and he'd studied Freud and R.D. Laing and all these psychologists because that's what he wanted to be at one point.
He wanted to be a psychiatrist, right?
Yeah, and then he thought a lot of it was nonsense, so he basically packed it in. But and in training too, I mean, Mike liked the Bill Pearl type physique.
Yeah.
So mass, you want to be big.
Right.
I'm not sure who Frank's heroes were, but Frank kind of created his own his own category almost. I mean, there wasn't a physique like Frank Zane until Frank Zane showed it.
Right. Yeah, I think Steve Reeves was a big influence, but
yeah,
as far as the definition and stuff that Frank had, I mean, he created his own, like you said, he created his own type. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Frank probably. I mean, I don't know. I've never really heard Frank speak particularly well of any of his competitors. To be honest.
Yeah.
So that was a 79. Mike, as he later admitted, said, I put too much emphasis on winning that contest. It's not in the tapes that you heard, but he did tell me, excuse me, of the 3 times that he came to a near-death experience in preparing for that show. I mean, the calories that he was consuming were almost non-existent, like 500,
John, right?
500, 600.
Yeah.
And then you'd ride a bike 40 miles on the beach or on the boardwalk on the beach.
Yeah.
Come back, pose in the sun for a while, then go back down and run 6 miles because you think the judges want definition.
Yeah.
And then you go into the gym and train the way Mike trained 3 days a week.
Yeah.
With negatives and forced reps and everything else.
Rest pause.
And as Boyer told you, remember when he was, he looked out his window in Sydney and he saw Mike walking up that, it was near the beach. There was a walkway up to the hotel. He said it took, by his estimation, Mike about 40 minutes to get up there.
Jeez.
Because he just was so exhausted. But Mike told me that he was eating dinner once with Kathy, and next thing you knew, his face was on his plate. He just boom out. And then, another time he couldn't get out of bed, just couldn't move his limbs to get out of bed. Couldn't lift his arm without being exhausted.
The 80 Olympia was in October, and I think he said he started preparing for it in February.
Yeah. Because he said everything he did was done with the purpose of how do I improve to win the 80 Olympia. Everything. He said, from going to the post office to taking out the garbage, what can I do today to improve?
Wow.
And so that was what he brought to bear on this contest.
Yeah.
Again, assuming it's above board in terms of the judging and everything else.
Yeah.
So when he went there, he knew what he put himself through to get into the kind of shape that he assumed the judges, at least the ones that he spoke to from the year before, to get the look they were looking for.
Right.
And then when Frank Zane had his accident and lost muscle, suddenly a lane had opened up to get to the Mr. Olympia.
Right.
So when he heard Arnold was going to compete, he, number one, when he looked at Arnold, he thought, well, I got nothing to worry about because that's not the Arnold I remember.
Yeah.
Arnold from 74, it's going to be like me looking at Robbie, before my Mr. Universe show.
Yeah.
But this Arnold, no, I don't think he's going to beat me.
Right.
And then we know how the Olympia played out. Mike was given 5th place and Arnold was given 1st place. And at that point, he just said it opened his eyes. He said, in retrospect, it was not a bad thing to have lost the 80 Olympia. So because it opened my eyes as to the reality of the commercial interests within the sport.
Yeah.
And once that was evident, he knew he wasn't going to win a contest.
Right.
That was over. That he wasn't going to win. So why put yourself through that kind of hellish training and dieting.
Yeah.
When you know that no one's looking at your physique anyway. They've already got the contest figured out.
Yeah.
Just who's going to win.
Yeah. During those interviews too, it was interesting hearing Mike talk about the meeting, the famous meeting that the morning of the contest where Arnold tried to psych everybody out. And he made that comment to Mike, and the whole meeting was about Arnold wanted to have the two classes, the under 200, over 200, where Mike and everybody else, all the other 15 competitors wanted one class.
Right.
And they all signed a petition and they showed it to Ben Weider, and then Arnold was the one who didn't want it. So Mike went into detail about that meeting. It was really interesting. He said he'd said a disparaging comment about Samir Bannout.
Yeah.
Which I never heard before. And
that was the first I'd heard about it too. Yeah. I don't know what the details were because that was from Peter's interview. Okay. So Peter didn't have a follow-up question on that. Yeah. But he just said, he knew Samir and he thought, Samir can handle himself. So if he wasn't offended by it, I'm not getting involved.
Right. And then I guess Bill Pearl stood up and he said, okay, well, we've got an issue here. We've got to resolve it. So, I'm not going to speak for you guys. You guys can debate this, but we have to resolve this issue before we get the contest underway. And then Boyer Coe stood up and he said, well, why don't we let Arnold take the floor and, let him speak on why he wants to have two classes. Everybody here wants to have one class. Arnold, let's hear your opinion. And then Arnold's response to that was, Boyer, why are you acting like a baby? Why don't you act like a man?
Yeah, I know. Like what?
And that Mike got pissed off and he goes, wait a minute. He goes, nobody's acting like a baby here except you. And then he goes, Mike Mentzer, everybody knows you lost the Olympia last year because you let your stomach hang out. And then Mike went over towards him with his finger and he said Arnold was standing up, and then Arnold sat down, which you see in the pictures, Arnold sitting down. And he goes, I don't know exactly what he said to him, but he said, everybody here is trying to conduct business and you're the one being a baby or whatever. And then Arnold backed down from him, and then it was getting really tense, and then Ben Weider stepped in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I always remember that photo when it first came out with Mike pointing his finger at Arnold. I was like, wow.
If there was ever a time when somebody should have had a video camera, that
would have been amazing. Classic. But, even to me, that buttressed Mike's legacy for me even more when that photo came out.
Yeah.
Because it was an embodiment of sticking it to the organization.
Yeah.
The commercial interests of bodybuilding were personified by Arnold.
Yeah.
Weider, the products. I mean, Ben ran the contest. Joe ran the publicity arm with the magazines for the contest.
Right.
Arnold was their poster boy who had no other job than to sell products for them.
Mm-hmm.
And here they are in this room, and there's Mike Mentzer in his face, basically telling him what a load of bullshit the whole thing was.
Yeah.
It was like, wow, that's a poster for me.
I know.
The guy who stood up to the industry. So I always like that. It's funny though. I mentioned about the stomach thing. I mean, whose stomach looked more ripped in 80? And I would even say in 79, when Mike does a vacuum shot, you telling me that's a big gut?
Right.
I don't think so. I mean, Frank Zane's the only guy that comes close on the vacuum to Mike. And even then, Mike's waist looks smaller. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was incredible. But the 79 photo that was referred to was, and the other thing too is that Mike trained his abs with weights.
Yeah.
So he had thick abs.
Yeah.
And his reasoning for that is, he said, what would be more incongruous than a guy that weighs 220 pounds having the abdominal development of a guy who weighs 140 pounds? Mm-hmm. He said, the muscles should be thick and well developed, and abs are skeletal muscles. They need to be developed too. So he was doing sit-ups with weights, and I mean, he had well-developed abdominal muscles. Right. Like you could probably stick your fingers in up to about here. In the cuts in his abs, but naturally when you exhale, it's not going to look like you're inhaling, but that wasn't why he lost the contest. But
we all know Arnold would say anything just to get under anybody's skin.
Well, it's funny, Mike also said, because Peter had asked him about Arnold, being later claiming that it was all a psych job. Mm-hmm. And Mike said, a load of crap. He goes, do you honestly think professionals and veterans like Boyer Coe or Chris Dickerson are going to be psyched out because Arnold raised an eyebrow?
Right. Right.
No, nobody was psyched out. They were just pissed off and ready to go on stage,
Yeah.
get it going. But
I just read Jack Neary's article about the 80 Olympia in one of my previous podcasts. So it was interesting rereading that because they said that CBS television only interviewed two people backstage, Arnold, because he was Arnold, and Mike Mentzer, because they thought Mike was going to win. And then, as you know, they never showed that footage ever, and
it's disappeared. Yeah. It's funny. About 10 years ago, I contacted Sherman Egan, who Boyer mentioned when you were interviewing.
Yeah.
And he was the producer there in Sydney for the 80 Olympia.
Right.
And he, I asked him, I said, can I ask you just independently, why it wasn't broadcast? I knew what Mike had told me, but I wanted to hear for myself from the guy that was there. And he said, we didn't broadcast, he said, because of the stink of the thing. That was his quote. He said it looked fixed and corrupt to us. And so he mentioned that he had some guys and he didn't remember their names, like Boyer and that, to watch it.
Yeah.
And he said that, he said the winner was being booed. He goes, we could hear it on our tape. He said, so how do you broadcast that?
Right.
Here he is, the greatest bodybuilder of all time. Boo! It's like, well, it didn't make sense.
Right.
And he didn't, and none of the people that were involved in the production thought Arnold was going to be the winner.
Right.
And these are guys that really don't know anything about bodybuilding, right? And
right.
So even they were looking at it and saying something's really off about this. And the fact that he wasn't doing the mandatory poses and was getting a perfect score. They couldn't make that connection. And so then I asked him, I said, well, is it possible to see the footage? Because I knew Boyer got to see it many years ago. Why not me?
Right.
And he said, let me call you back. He said, I'll check with our archives. And he called me back and said, it's gone. He said, I have no idea what happened to it.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
They don't even have it. Yeah.
So I don't know what happened to it. I do know Arnold has since purchased the rights to the comeback. Oh, and that's mothballed now. So you're not going to see that except maybe on YouTube.
Right.
So the only footage, such as it is Wayne Galash's of the 80 Olympia. And it's too bad. If you look at
Norm Comich, did you ever see that footage, John? Norm Comich, are you aware of him?
See the guy from Australia
he was a fan who lived in New York, and he was in Australia then. I guess.
Yes.
Sitting in the balcony, and he had his camera with him, and he.
I think Wayne Galash worked out a deal with him.
Yeah, he did. He put
that's where I saw it. It's on a 2 DVD set.
Yeah.
But it's cool. I mean, it's a different angle, but man, you need Dramamine to watch it. It's just like all over the place. So
right.
It's too bad. It would have been nice to see really good quality footage.
Yeah, I know.
But anyway, that was the end for Mike. That was well, truthfully, he decided he wasn't going to compete the next year. But then when the 81 Olympia went down and it was another, dragon's or viper's nest of corruption, he just decided the whole industry is it's over. So that was the end for that.
I don't want to keep it too long, John, but if we could talk just a little bit about what happened with Mike, where he went through that bad period. Because he said in the interview that when he was training for the 80 Olympia, he started doing amphetamines. And that's why he was doing such an incredible work output, where he was doing all this cardio and eating these low calories and, training so intensely. And he said he would get up at like 4:00 in the morning and read philosophy for 3 hours. And then, he had so much energy and he was so productive because of the amphetamines. And he wasn't doing the amphetamines, like he said in the interview, to get high. Because he was never into that. He was just using it as a performance enhancing drug. Yeah.
He wanted, I guess if you're on 500 calories a day.
Yeah.
And your goal is to look a certain way, which requires a huge energy output.
Yeah.
Your body is going to basically tell you not to do that at some point.
Right.
Knock it off. Don't do it. And I guess the amphetamines probably gave him the ability to find the energy to do what he needed to do. And as long as it was directed, there wasn't a problem. It wasn't, they were, as I understand it, they were prescription. He wasn't getting them on the street.
Yeah.
And he wasn't, taking them by the handful, but he was taking them. And then after the 80 Olympia, and after being essentially blacklisted in bodybuilding, he went to work for Arthur Jones briefly, about 6 months.
Right.
That didn't work out, but it turned out that he was offered a job as to be the editor of his own magazine. It was called Workout Magazine.
Right.
And he loved it. But he was also, same sort of tunnel vision with the magazine that he was for the 80 Olympia. It had to be the best. It had to be better than the competition. And that meant he was going to write more articles. He was going to be involved in the photo shoots. He was going to be involved in the layout design. He was going to be talking to the distributors, all of that stuff. So amphetamines again, to just keep him focused. And then suddenly you're up 2 or 3 days in a row and you're not aware of it. Working. And then he got a phone call when they were about into their 11th issue or so, that the money guy for Workout Magazine said, you know what, put my money on something else. Magazine's done. Click. So now this thing that you've been so invested in, just like he was with bodybuilding in 80, it's been ripped away from you. It's gone. You better find another line of work.
Right.
And on top of that, his dad dies, his hero, about 2 weeks later or something. And on top of that, he breaks up with the girlfriend that he's been with for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So wham, 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 about 3 or 4 emotional shots in a row with amphetamines. So what happened was reality changed, his perception of reality. I used to get phone calls from him at that point. And it would be Mike, and then it would be Mike talking. It would be like me saying to you, have you seen the new Muscle and Fitness that just came out? And we're having a conversation. Yep. Yeah, and I flipped the page and, I was, there were 3 dancing bears and they were staring at me. And that's how the conversation would go.
Wow.
And it was like, and for me, as someone who knew Mike well, the fact that he'd started the conversation out normally, rationally, I knew he was there. That Mike Mentzer was there.
Right.
And suddenly this other thing had come in. And to me, it was almost like a puff of smoke had come up to kind of obscure that. And I was trying to reach through it to keep a tether on it. And the thing that turned it around for him, interestingly enough, was philosophy. And it was the knowledge that the principle of identity and objectivism, which seems very simplistic, says a thing is what it is. Everything has a nature. Your mind has a nature. Your muscles have a nature. That's how we know how to isolate them when we train them.
Okay.
And figuring out how the mind functions in terms of what it accepts into its consciousness, and then is processed through the subconscious, so that it stays within you.
Right.
And whatever he had done had shifted that, so that things that were not reality were coming into his consciousness and now being stored in the subconscious, and that became his reality. But when he read this passage in Ayn Rand, that part of the philosophy, that things are what they are, that the mind has an identity, that you choose what comes into your mind. You can choose to accept the negative and the nonsense or this or that, or you can focus on what was real. And then taking that and applying it back to what was real before this thing happened was an act of willpower on his part, that the drugs that they gave him during periods of institutionalization couldn't equal. And they would just pacify you. But suddenly, through an act of will and applying his mind, he was able to recognize that a lot of these phantasms that he'd been experiencing weren't real. I mean, he was the last one to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
But he would be institutionalized and come out and say, well, these, you just don't get it. You know, what I know, this is real. This really happened, blah, blah, blah. And I think part of it was wishful thinking, wanting the world to be different than it was. Not as much hurt in it for him in terms of death of family members, loss of ideals, bodybuilding, loss of productive creative work like a magazine. You know, clearly that was painful. The world suddenly was very, very ugly place.
Yeah.
And to top it off, nobody from the bodybuilding world cared.
Was supportive, right?
No, they just opened another can of bodybuilders. What do we care about him? You know, so that, I know that hurt him, but he also, you know, kind of accepted it and said, hey, I know everybody's got their life problems, right? They don't have time to worry about me, but it would have been nice if somebody gave a shit, you know.
I think in the interview with Peter, he did mention you, John. He said you were the only one really that reached out to him. And
well, I mean, Mike was a friend. He was a hero figure to me. And I probably would have been no different than if your hero had contacted you and you thought, what can I do to help? You know, and it was a human being in need of help, you know, and Mike had meant too much to me to say, oh, I'm not going to take the call. I remember sometimes it'd be on the phone for 4 hours.
Wow.
But I knew that I could reach him.
Yeah.
You know, and then I'd get him on one. Like there was a time where he was convinced that God existed. No, Mike was an atheist when I knew him. And suddenly he, again, you know, the imperfect world, the perfect world, someone who cares, a being that cares. And how does that tie in? Well, you know, the Nautilus symbol is very spiritual. It represents stages in a journey in various religions and Eastern thoughts. And Arthur Jones designed a cam that looks like a nautilus shell. And if you ever look at the human body, the cochlea of the ear is shaped like a nautilus. This is the stuff he was saying. And you know, therefore, Arthur Jones was God.
Right.
I was like, what? I said, Mike, come on. Like, listen, you don't believe any of that. You even said to me at one point that you didn't believe in God because that would mean that there is such a thing as a realer reality, which is a contradiction in terms. There is only this reality.
Right.
And it was that kind of thing that I think Mike appreciated later, because it was causing him to snap out of it a bit. And to rethink that, yeah, okay, there is a real reality. That is reality. And then again, the law of identity and blah, blah, blah. But when people later said, man, you know, he went on about philosophy and Ayn Rand a lot. Well, yeah, it saved his life, literally. Yeah. If he hadn't, like for some people that are in prison, it's the Bible or the Quran or something that has given their head a shake and brought them back to leading a better life.
Right.
With Mike, it was philosophy, and specifically Ayn Rand's philosophy. And since he knew that without that philosophy, he would probably be dead, he took it seriously. And so when young bodybuilders would ask him about topics that might seem frivolous, Mike would answer philosophically, because he wanted them to inculcate those principles where they wouldn't allow distorting agents into their minds the way he did, which led to the problems. So yeah, he did. There were two Mike Mentzers that I knew, and the first one was the seeker. So up until 1980, Mike didn't believe. Well, he was seeking truth. He read anything he can get his hands on in philosophy, existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Friedrich Nietzsche in particular, trying to find truth. See, that's what he liked about Arthur Jones. Jones was very dogmatic and matter of fact and black and white, and this is right and this is wrong. And the Nautilus machine is a rational barbell and it's better than this. Right. That appealed to Mike, you know, but he was a seeker then. He was looking for truth. And then there was the Mike that believed he had found it. And that was the post mental illness period, if you will, where philosophy became his religion in a way, and specifically objectivist philosophy, because it had literally made a life-changing difference to him, and pulled him out of, it pulled him out of suicide, I would say, on occasion.
Yeah.
Mike Mentzer could have left us many years before he did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, to me, it's funny. Bill DeSimone, whom I have tremendous respect for in the bodybuilding world, he's a brilliant biomechanist when it comes to exercise. Said, Mike Mentzer's story is a cautionary tale, and I don't know. I view it as anytime if you try to emulate someone else's life, that is a cautionary tale. Don't do it, because it's not you.
Yeah.
Be who you are. Don't try and ape someone else's persona. But when you look at what he did and how high he went in bodybuilding and how far he fell, only to have a self-made renaissance, to come back and launch personal training, which is now the template for all of us one-on-one personal trainers.
Yeah.
And to have a Mr. Olympia or a future Mr. Olympia fall under his tutelage and win back-to-back Mr. Olympias.
Yeah.
That's quite a comeback story.
Yeah.
And what makes it more impressive is it was by sheer application of his will to make himself better.
Yeah.
That it accomplished it, or that it happened. So cautionary, perhaps, but really you're doing him a disservice if that's all you see. This is a very inspiring story on the early level, physically, great physique. But on the latter stage, mentally and intellectually, to be able to, through the power of your own mind and the ideas that you put in your mind, defeat mental illness.
Yeah.
I almost don't want to call it mental illness because it was episodic. It wasn't, like a manic depressiveness that had run through a family for generations. But when you were institutionalized up to 3 times, you got a problem.
Yeah.
And there's a problem with the mind. Something's not processing things properly.
Right.
But to recognize that while you're in that dark rinse cycle, and pull yourself out to me is phenomenal. It's an amazing achievement. And I
didn't realize I did that, John, until I heard the interviews. I didn't know
he said that in the article that Peter McGuff wrote. I think you find it online, but it's as I mentioned before, it's probably the single best article written about Mike. And until now, I've never really talked about the things that Mike and I talked about when he was in that condition, but I think it might serve as helpful maybe for people that are maybe in a similar position, that you can heal yourself to some degree.
Yeah.
Barring a chemical imbalance that is genetic or something like that. That a lot of it has to do with the old thing, garbage in, garbage out. It depends on what you accept in as being true and what is not, but that there is a means you have to filter that, so that things don't have to go off the rails.
I think some people in the bodybuilding world believe that he was so upset over the 1980 Olympia that he went crazy and he was walking the street.
Yeah, no.
And it has nothing to do with
Mike was, he was over that. If you look at the videos, I think I put a couple up on my Facebook page. Just excerpts of him bantering with Boyer Coe when they were at Nautilus. That was in 1983. That was 2 years after the Olympia. He doesn't look like a guy who's stewing too much about it.
Right.
He's having fun. They're working out. They're talking, cracking jokes.
Right.
No, it was a perfect storm of emotional issues that hit all together at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sent him off the rails. And there, as they say, but for the grace of God, could be any one of us, right? Who knows how we'd react if your livelihood was suddenly pulled out from under you, your faith was ripped away from you, and your parents are killed.
Yeah, it's here.
And your girlfriend is out of your life, all back to back to back to back.
Yeah.
And you're taking an exogenous agent, the sole purpose of which is to keep you awake. So that's all you think about.
Right.
You know?
Right.
You might be looking for something to get your mind off it somehow, you know.
Yeah. So what was Mike's ultimate, what actually killed him? It was a heart attack, right?
Yeah, I saw somewhere online they said he died from too many painkillers, but that's not the case. I've seen his autopsy report.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just cardiac arrest, but he'd had like 3 silent heart attacks. Last time I saw him, he was in the Veterans Hospital in Santa Monica, and he'd gone in there because he'd had a heart attack. And so, I mean, his health, he had some problems there in the last 2 or 3 years of his life. He'd fallen down the stairs, he torn a tricep, he had he had neck surgery. So he was in pain from his neck. Then there was some sort of blood disorder because he was going to give Ray a kidney, his brother. He was going to donate a kidney to him.
Right.
And then when they checked the blood, they said, hey, you can't. There's a problem here. And that's when he had a clotting issue. So I know he was on blood thinners because he developed a nosebleed and had to be hospitalized again because it wouldn't stop. And then, you know, that was the time when I saw him in the hospital. I thought, well, you can't train clients like this, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, phone maybe. Yeah. But I thought, you know, what can I do to, to help? You know, how can I help? And it dawned on me that he hadn't had a book in the bookstores since 1981, 82.
Okay.
But I thought, yeah, the bodybuilding world knows about him.
Yeah.
Because he was an Ironman at that point. But you still had to, it was a pain in the ass. It was mail order.
Yeah.
If you wanted his book, you had to clip the coupon or call him and send money in, and you wait for the thing. I thought, wouldn't it be neat to have as a lightning rod in the mainstream in the bookstores, a book?
Yeah.
And people could go to your website from reading the book, and maybe they book a consult or whatever. So he said, I don't know if I'm up to writing a lot. I said, here's the beauty of it, Mike. You've already written it. I said, because I have every article you've ever written.
Right.
I have every book you've ever written.
Right.
So what we'll do is just go over and say, right now, from your vantage point, what are the valid principles of training?
Right.
Not what you wrote in the 70s, unless you think they're still valid.
Yeah.
And let's just focus on that. So that's what I did. I went through all of his writings, put together, I just basically arranged them in chapters, and I sent them to Mike and said, what do you think? Yeah, no, that's out. That's okay. I'll add this to that, blah, blah, blah. And within, I don't know, I'd say 3 months it was done. The manuscript was done.
Wow, okay.
And then starting in April, I reached out to a publisher and tried to get them interested and pitch the book. And they didn't know, hardcore bodybuilding, it's not really their thing. But it went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, they sent an agreement over in April. And I didn't like the agreement. I thought it was too boilerplate.
Yeah.
And Mike was saying, well, it'd be nice to get the advance, So anyway, it's funny. I pulled this out before we did our thing night. This is the final agreement that came through. It was May 8th.
Okay.
2001. So they had the manuscript already at that point. Mike had signed off on it. And they sent this May 8th, 2001. The publisher had signed it in May.
Wow.
And I signed it on June 6th, 2001.
Wow.
And then sent, there was 3 copies. And then I sent by FedEx overnight to Mike, and he signed it on June 7th, 2001.
Wow.
4 days before he died.
Wow.
And then sent it to the publisher. And then he was dead 4 days later.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so that was tough doing that book because it was the last thing I had with Mike. You know, the publisher would contact me and, you know, what photos we putting in, and I was like, oh God, you know, I go through photos and there it is. But that became high intensity training the Mike Mentzer way.
Okay.
So that was the last thing we worked on, and indeed that may be the last autograph he gave, because it was only, like I say, 4 days before he died.
Wow. Great. Unbelievable. Did his dad die of a heart attack, John?
I believe that's what it was. Yeah, there was a history of heart trouble in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some respects, we were lucky we had him as long as we did.
Yeah.
You know, I think there was a genetic time bomb in there ready to go off. And he only lived to be 49, unfortunately. So that's not very old. You know, I'm 60 now, so I look back and think, good Lord. Yeah. You know, I was 40 when he died, or almost 40.
Yeah, I remember everybody at the time thought I was really young. We were all shocked when he did pass, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's interesting, like you say, he has changed bodybuilding.
Yeah.
He did live a very interesting life, and to know him was to learn from him. Yeah. He threw off a lot of sparks, you know, and which started a lot of fires for people.
Right.
But he was super helpful, very funny guy, a very caring guy, and in many respects a very forgiving guy for a lot of what he had suffered. But he was, there isn't a day goes by I don't miss him, you know, because things that I know would have meant something to him, I can't share it with him now. Like I did a documentary on Leonard Peikoff, who is Ayn Rand's right-hand guy. He was a student of hers for 30 years, knew her better than anyone. When she died, he was her legal and intellectual heir. Yeah. And Mike had written to Leonard Peikoff before and was a fan, had his books, had some of his courses. And for me to do this film on the guy and spend time with him at his house, I mean, I would have loved to have picked up the phone, Mike, you know, say hello to. I couldn't do it. So anyway, there's just things like that make me think about him quite a bit, you know.
His popularity continues, you know, 20 years after his death. He's still, like I said, the interview we did together last year was like one of my highest downloaded interviews, I think, because we were talking about Mike Mentzer.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that it would only be downloaded because of Mike Mentzer. You know, it's I don't fool myself. I'm a footnote on that story, but he's he's a fascinating guy, and a guy who did stand up for what he believed in. Yeah, and that's always inspiring to people. Yeah, and a smart guy who was a fount of interesting ways to look at the world. You know, I always remember interviewing him and him saying, anything I am or am not is a result of the choices I've made or my abdication thereof. And it was like, Jesus. A, who talks like that? And B, that's a profound statement. You know, whereas I remember going to a seminar with that Arnold did, and it was, you got to buy all the books and courses of everybody and see what works for you. Right. Well, that was worth a $50. Thanks, Bob. But it was, Mike Mentzer seminar was unlike any other seminar. I mean, it was like going to university. Yeah. You would sit down and he would go to the chalkboard and he would go through nutritional science. Yeah. Not, not fattest beliefs or protein or supplement sales. And he would go through physiology and the requirements of productive exercise, and including genetics and realistic expectations. And it was a great learning experience, you know, and there's nobody that's come forward since then that can take his place, you know, that has done it. Yeah. Most of it is still back to our night big, you know, and I
wonder what he would have thought about bodybuilding today.
Hard to say. I mean, he was at heart a fan. So Mike would have been up on who was the Mr. Olympia was and all that.
Yeah.
And he liked mass, so he probably wouldn't be too taken aback by it.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
But he would probably still be trying his damnedest to get him to cut back their volume and frequency.
Right.
Yeah. But it's interesting because, he did his, he talked about people that were not great responders on that continuum, and that for those people, sometimes 2 or 3 sets once every 10 days was optimal.
Yeah.
And it's funny, again, at my facility, I train regular folk, not a Mr. Olympia candidate to be seen.
Right.
But when we tested people's composition and when they responded from a workout, like when the results showed up, it was usually 7 days on average. And we found that, I hate to say it, but we found 2 sets once a week produced more in terms of lean mass than 3 sets once a week, 4 sets once a week, or 6 sets once a week. Which, make of it what you will. But for regular people who are, older, not in their peak years, 17 to 20.
Right.
The recovery ability isn't what it was when they were at that age.
Yeah.
So you have to treat that as a component of the workout, the rest interval, every bit as much as the workout itself.
Yeah.
In terms of importance. And interestingly enough, that's what Mike Mentzer was advocating way back 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so was he crazy or was he ahead of the curve?
Well, he must have had something because to be remembered all these years, obviously he made a huge impact in the sport of bodybuilding for sure.
Oh, yeah. No, he was a good man and be sorely missed.
Yeah,
still is.
Absolutely. Still is, right.
Thank you to you and your podcast. We can still remember him from time to time.
Absolutely. And thank you, John, for coming on the show and talking at length about Mike. And before I let you go, talk about the project you got coming up later this year, because I think it's really interesting. The book.
Oh, what the hell is he talking about? Well, the book I'm working on has nothing to do with bodybuilding.
Right.
Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah. I just thought.
Yeah, but it's it's a true crime story. It's coming out in 2 volumes because it's lengthy.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating story about an Irish family that immigrated to Canada in the 1800s.
Okay.
And they were kind of like a family of Mike Mentzer's in a way, in that they were autonomous. They didn't bend a knee to anybody. And what happened over time was they were very loyal to their family. There was they were called the Donnellys.
Okay.
And I believe there was 7 sons and 1 daughter.
Okay.
And the sons all grew into big, strong, muscular, good-looking guys who didn't take any crap from anybody.
Okay.
So as long as they had that nucleus or that family, people cut them a wide berth. And they were tough. I mean, they were tough as nails, these guys.
Yeah.
Fight at the drop of a hat. And one of them fought a constable in the town for 30 minutes nonstop.
Wow.
And a crowd of 100 people gathered around. And when someone went to break it up, another constable showed up with a revolver and said, "No, it's fair fight. Let him go." 30 minutes. But that's the way they were. But because they were loyal to their family, they're certain of it was very factional at that time in Canada and probably the United States as well with the Irish immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
You had the Catholics that stayed amongst themselves, the Protestants that stayed amongst themselves. You didn't interact. You went to your respective churches. You went to Catholic or Protestant businesses in the nearest towns. And the Donnelly said, screw that. This is a new country. This isn't Ireland. We'll go where we want.
Uh-huh.
If I want to spend money in a Protestant store, I'll spend it in a Protestant store. And if I want to spend it, at the Catholic store, I'll spend it at the Catholic store. And no one's going to tell us how to spend our money or what to do. Well, over a period of time, a faction developed that was anti-Donnelly.
Okay.
They were too terrified to do anything when all the brothers were around, but enough time passed that one brother was killed in a knife fight, another one died of pneumonia. 3 had moved away and started families. Suddenly the group that was behind now got brave. And one night at about 1 a.m, they snuck into this house where the parents and the son and a cousin from Ireland were staying and beat them to death. And then set fire to the house, burned it down, and then went up the road where another brother was staying with another brother, called him to the door and shot him, killed him. And so that there was only 3 brothers left out of 7, and a daughter. And unbeknownst to the mob that did this, there was about 30 to 40 of them. There was a 14-year-old boy that had been staying overnight with the Donnellys who hid under the bed and saw everything.
Oh, wow.
So they had an eyewitness to the murders. But they had 2 trials, and both trials they acquitted the killers because it was the township jury. And they knew that if one guy hung, 20 guys would hang, and that would be 20 families impacted, which would be 20 less customers coming into your shop in town, 20 less families tithing in the church.
Right.
So they closed around their own and protected them so that the murderers got away with it. But the Donnellys still stayed pretty resolute. They were, again, a tough group. And it's a fascinating story that is not taught in Canadian history classes. Because, Canadians, like a lot of British people, and of course, Canada was a British province for a long time, always look down our nose at Americans, because you're wild and uncouth.
Right.
Well, it turns out we're just as bad as the Americans, so it's we just didn't want to talk about it,
Right.
So we had our Wild West period too.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, just like the American Wild West period. That's fascinating, And so rather than try to pretend it didn't occur, I want to try and bring it up to the surface and say, this is what it was. Embrace it. This is where we come from.
I can't wait to read it. It sounds awesome. So it'll be out in the fall, right, John?
Yeah, it's supposed to be coming out in October.
Okay. All right. Well,
Called The Donnellys.
all right. I'll keep all my listeners abreast of that so we can all support you.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right.
Great talking to you, John, as always. So
Yeah, it's great talking to you, John.
yeah, you be well, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thanks for all your stories about Mike Mentzer. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Take care of yourself.
You too, pal.
All right.